Hello Overclockers, I'm 8pack, the king of overclocking, and in fact, the king of pretty much everything. I know you've tuned in today to YouTube to only watch me, and I don't blame you. Right, on to the purpose of this video, and that being said, let's get into it. Hello Overclockers, I'm Ian Parry, also known as the world famous overclocker 8pack. You may have already seen or watched my Threadripper 7000 series video. If you haven't, I suggest you check that one out as it's a prequel to this video. To watch that, check the links in the description below. In this video, what I'm going to be covering is basically, does Octo channel, which is offered on the WRX 90 platform, have a marked improvement on performance when you compare it to the quad channel format of TRX 50. So, that being said, let's get into it. So, to make this testing uniform on both TRX 50 and WRX 90, obviously I'm going to use the same memory modules at the same speed with the same density. And the memory modules I'm testing here are by Micron, and those were 96GB in capacity, that's per module, 4800 MHz DDR5 RDIMM modules. So obviously in quad channel that meant I was using 384 gig, and in octo channel I'm now using 768 GB of capacity. For this testing of WRX 90, to actually run in octo channel we have to choose a Threadripper Pro CPU. Remember, the non-Pro 7 series models can only work up to quad channel. So for this one, I chose the 32-core, 64-thread 7975WX model. And I basically chose this because it's probably going to be the most popular CPU in the stack. And also it runs at the highest clock speed, or I could overclock it to the highest clock speed and hopefully therefore really boost the bandwidth. When overclocking this, on water cooling, 5.2 GHz for all loads was quite easily possible. So for all this testing, I used the WRX 90 board that we have on the desk next to me here. This is a pre-production sample by ASRock, and it's from their WS range. Now I can report that even though this is a pre-production sample, the overclocking was absolutely excellent and the board was stable throughout all my testing. And although 8 sticks is double the stress, if you like, on the memory control of the CPU, I had no problems with getting 768 GB of memory stable with the exact same overclock as I could on the TRX 50 board. So initial testing on this board tells me that this is a very solid board. Now, I think at this point it's important to also mention that that's not the only benefit of WRX 90 compared to TRX 50. The WRX 90 motherboard also, when you pair it with a Pro CPU, offers you 128 PCI Express lanes versus the 48 that you've got on the TRX 50. And it also offers literally double the capacity as well as obviously double the channels of memory. So on the TRX 50 board, you can only have up to 1 TB capacity, whereas on this particular platform here, you can have 2 TB. So essentially this platform is a more premium platform and it exploits everything available on that Pro CPU. So more PCI Express lanes, more memory channels. So that's the hardware that I used for this testing, and obviously I accompanied that with my Stendos, Windows install, 4090, and so on and so on. Everything that I did on the previous video for testing the CPUs within the TRX 50 format. So in the WRX 90, what did we actually see just from going from 4 memory channels to 8 memory channels? Basically, quad channel versus octo gave us a 3.3% improvement in our Overclockers Blender render test. It gave us a 10.5% improvement on Cinebench 2024. It gave us a 1.3% improvement on Cinebench R23. On the V-Ray test, we got an increase of 7%. And on Corona, we saw an increase of 4.4%. Corona being obviously the rendering benchmark that we covered previously. I also did some testing in Linux when running FEA style simulations, if you like, that many of our customers tend to run. And I saw in Abacus around an 18% improvement and in OptiStruct around a 20% improvement. From those performance results, we can see that some apps take use of having that extra memory bandwidth more than others. But I guess if you average out the results across the whole stack that I just mentioned, we've got around a 10% increase in performance, which is certainly worth having if you are going to spend extra on the Pro CPU. So, in summary, what is WRX 90 for and who does it really suit? I would suggest that this platform, along with the Pro CPUs, really suits the very, very high-end user who wants to tune into the last 10 to 12% of performance, and of course are willing to pay for that extra performance, because the extra cost of the motherboard, CPU and memory is much more than the 10% improvement that you gain. Now of course, if you're a company who are rendering something that maybe takes 3 days and you're saving over 10%, that's quite a big chunk of performance. But if you're, just doing a little bit of media work yourself and you do the odd render that maybe takes 50 minutes or an hour, I certainly wouldn't plump for this platform. I'd also be looking at this platform if you need massive multi-GPU support. Anything over 3 GPUs, you can still get full lanes on here. In fact, there's no problem with plugging 7 GPUs into this platform. And obviously, if you want to really stack out the PCI Express slots with extra PCI Express 5.0 generation drives and you need that extra speed, again, this platform is suitable for you. Obviously, currently we have 8-pack Threadripper bundles on the TRX 50 platform, and as soon as this platform is officially launched and we have stock of the motherboards, I will be introducing a range of bundles on this particular motherboard. If there's anything that you need that may not be listed on our website, obviously contact us, because we are currently developing a whole range of servers and systems operating on this particular platform, including those up to 5, 6 or even 7 GPU, and a new Supernova rig to be one of my flagships, which will sit right at the very top of the range. And as always, don't like the video, don't subscribe to our channel, and certainly don't follow me on any socials. But do check out my PCI lanes. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-pack, a professional overclocker based here at Overclockers UK. In this video, what I'm going to be talking about is the new 14900KS CPU by Intel. And what I'm going to be doing is testing this CPU in terms of stock performance, TDP and power output, what cooling you need and overall cooling performance, and then of course any recommendations I have for tuning the CPU to give better performance through overclocking. So, all that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so we've introduced the CPU that we're going to be talking about here. That's the 14900KS. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about this processor. When you're comparing it to the i9-14900K, this new version, the 14900KS, has exactly the same number of performance cores, which is 8. Those all have hyper-threading. And it has exactly the same number of efficiency cores, which is 16. These cores are clocked at a much lower frequency than the performance cores and do not have hyperthreading. So essentially the 14900K equals the 14900KS in terms of cores and indeed architecture. The only real difference between two CPUs is the higher boost clock out of the box on the KS version, which is 6.2 GHz versus 6 GHz straight. So you've got a 200 MHz uplift for the KS CPU. Now, according to Intel's spec, this means that at stock, the K has a TDP of 125 watts and the KS has a TDP of 150 watts. However, when I was testing using the boost algorithms at complete stock, I found that the 14900K gave 355 watts maximum power draw, whereas the KS has a 405 watts maximum power draw. Basically, obviously, this translates into you needing a better PSU and better cooling to keep the KS version cool and benefit from the extra frequency. Both of these CPUs can be installed in the same platform, so Z790 on a socket 1700 board. And I suggest that obviously if you are going to use the KS, that you update the BIOS on your motherboard in line with the KS voltage table to allow for the absolute maximum performance. So, what was the test system specs when I was testing this CPU? What I used was the Asus Dark Hero Z790 motherboard on the latest BIOS. I used the 14900KS CPU with a custom water cooling loop. Now, normally I do these videos initially with an AIO cooler, but with 405 watts of stock power needed, the AIO was really being pushed too hard and the CPU was thermal throttling quite quickly. So I decided to quickly go straight into the custom loop. This custom loop had a quad radiator, a Nexus pump, and an EK water block, just the standard Velocity 2 water block. What I was using for testing was Team Group 7600 MHz memory with the memory set at XMP. I was using my standard Windows 11 install with all the latest drivers for the motherboard, the chipset, the I/O, and of course the GPU as well, as the GPU is important within the gaming or the 3D testing. Now we've covered the test system, let's go into what the stock results were and the stock BIOS settings. Now when I say stock BIOS settings, I mean absolutely everything stock default BIOS with just XMP enabled. So the only thing different that could be different in your system was your memory speed, and here I was running 7600 MHz Team Group memory, 32 gig capacitor. So what were the stock results then? 14900K versus 14900KS. On our OC UK Blender test, on this KS CPU took 1 hour 1 minute, which was a 3% improvement over the K. Our 3D Mark Firestrike physics test, and this was at 1080p, scored a 6.7% improvement over the K. The Firestrike graphics test, which is again at 1080p, scored an 8% improvement over the K. Cinebench R23 on multi-core was a 7.8% improvement over the K, with single core rocking about a 3% improvement again on Cinebench. Superposition at 1080p scored a 9% improvement over the stock K. Unigen Valley, again at 1080p, scored a 6.8% improvement over the K. And then finally our Final Fantasy benchmark, which was at 1080p with medium settings, scored a 0.65% improvement over the K. So what we can see from all these results, some of which of course are professional benchmarks, some of which are standard single core, some which are multi-core, some which are gaming style, we can see that overall the average increase is about 5.6%. So it is a reasonable improvement in terms of performance. 5.6% is not to be sniffed at, I guess, but the main thing here is that you're actually adding 10% of power and you're needing more cooling to get that 5.6%. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Even with custom water cooling on the KS, that does become restricted by thermals. If you run something like a Blender test for an extended period of time, and our Blender test does take in excess of 1 hour, so that was hitting the point where the CPU needed to thermal throttle down. Even multiple Cinebench runs back to back, which I tend to do 30 minutes of, that was also hitting the thermal threshold even on custom water on the KS. And also the KS does come with a premium price over the K product. So you'll have to weigh up for you whether you want to pay the extra for the cooling, pay the extra for the CPU itself, and pay the extra for the power draw to get this 5.6% worth of performance. So for overclocking and tuning of this particular CPU, I wanted to max out the best possible gaming profile stroke low core count profile, which would obviously be good for things like CAD, photo editing, and these type of applications that don't need many cores. Of course, very good for gaming as well. And then I also wanted to create a profile that was very good in your massively multi-threaded workloads, such as game development, rendering, and simulation as examples. Both of these types of profile will be available in my 8-pack gaming bundles, which I've developed in conjunction with this video and in conjunction with the research that I did for this video into how best tune the CPU. As you'll see, you don't really want to leave this CPU at stock when you can improve performance, power draw, and therefore temperatures by manually tuning it. So, the gaming profile I came up with for this was a 5.9 GHz static overclock with a +2 ratio of TVB. Now to gain this, we did the hyperthreading disabled, and I disabled also 8 of the efficiency cores. Of course, none of these features are needed in gaming. And I must note that if you do turbo velocity boost overclocking with +2 with HT on, the system was unstable anyway. But in this case, it wouldn't help for what I'm trying to achieve. Turning off half the CPU cores reduced power draw, and of course it reduced temperatures, so it can boost higher for much longer. And I ensured a higher boost clock for even longer still by setting a boost offsetting the temperature for 10 degrees. And I found this was stable throughout all workloads. So essentially that means that the CPU was not clocking down each boost till 10 degrees higher. So of course the maximum boost on the CPU, 5.9 plus 2 is 6.1. And then when you get to a certain temperature, which is 10 degrees higher than it would normally be to switch down, it's then going to 6. And the lowest possible, no matter what workloads, it's going to 5.9. And obviously you gamers know that it's actually the speed of the CPU when you're playing your games that makes the main difference to the actual frame rate. So what we're doing with this is we're keeping 6.1 as absolutely long as possible. We're keeping 6 as long as possible. And then the minimum is 5.9, which is really affecting your gaming to positives. And we're doing this essentially by really controlling the power draw of the CPU, and we're controlling the temperature of the CPU. Now, what was the power draw after all these little tweaks? We found that the power draw dropped to only 237 watts, obviously from the maximum of 405 watts, which is a 70% less power draw. And what we also found when even running very heavy multi-threaded on this kind of a CPU tweak, we saw only 72 degrees on the CPU, which was 39 degrees cooler. And I guess it could be said really with these type of tweaks, we no longer needed the custom loop in effect. Yeah, we would have added a few degrees extra to the temperatures, but it would be well below the 100 degrees threshold and maybe only pushing a maximum of 78 to 80 degrees. So not only have we improved power draw, we've improved performance in gaming, we've improved temperatures, we've also made it that we don't need to spend as much on our cooling, and it's easier to fit it in a smaller case as well. So what was the improvement in the KS overclocked gaming profile versus the KS stock profile? Obviously our render test took longer because that's a multi-core test, taking 24% longer, but my goal here wasn't to improve the render test. The Firestrike graphics, however, which is a gaming test, that was 16.5% improved over the stock K, which is exactly what I was trying to gain. The 3D Mark Firestrike physics dropped 19.6%, but again, physics is a multi-core thing, and again, something that I wasn't trying to improve. Multi-core Cinebench again dropped, but again it's multi-core, so it's not really what this profile is about. Single core saw a 0.4% improvement. Superposition saw a 2.7% improvement. Valley saw a 2.3% improvement, and Final Fantasy saw a 0.3% improvement. So overall, the gaming profile gains were 4.5% versus stock in the gaming benchmarks. And also, obviously, this is causing a large reduction in performance on the multi-threaded task. But anyone who wants to do a multi-threaded task would obviously, having bought one of my bundles, would then go into the BIOS and switch to the multi-threaded profile to gain the benefit there. This undoubtedly is definitely the best performance gaming-wise you can get out of this CPU, and at the same time, obviously it does have the expense of multi-core, but at the same time you're reducing power draw, you're reducing the effective cooling that you need by reducing the overall thermal envelope and the TDP. So now we've gone over the single core settings and results, let's go over the multi-core settings. Now for multi-core, the maximum overclock I could get on this stable was 5.6 gigahertz, with all the E-cores at 4.5 gigahertz. So essentially that meant that I could get around 100 megahertz more on the P-cores and around 100 megahertz more on the E-cores than I could on the standard K version. So Intel essentially have given us better silicon for the KS than they did with the K, and that's been proven out by the higher boost clocks, of course, when you're trying to take it higher for gaming, and also for the higher maintain clocks across all the cores when you're trying to take it a little bit higher for multi-threaded workloads. Now, this particular profile resulted in only using 278 watts when doing all multi-core work, and also had a peak temperature of 76C again when doing all multi-threaded work. And again, this was a huge improvement over the stock profile. Basically, you save 46% in power draw whilst getting 31% cooler results. And again, with this particular profile, you wouldn't need to use a custom loop. A 360 AIO would work fine. It maybe wouldn't be as low as 76 degrees under maximum load, but it would certainly not be more than mid-80s, which again is a perfect result. So what was the performance of the multi-core profile against your stock settings? Well, if the Blender render test had a 1% improvement. The 3D Mark's graphics test, again, that's more of a, where the gaming profile would work better, had a 1.3% reduction. Firestrike Physics, however, had a 1.6% improvement, that being a multi-core test. Cinebench multi-core, 0.7% improvement. Cinebench single core had an 8% reduction because, again, this is not a gaming, it's not a single core type profile. We had a slight reduction in superposition, which is gaming, slight reduction in Unigen Valley, which is gaming, and finally Final Fantasy, we also had a slight reduction, which is gaming. So what you can see, basically everything that I targeted this profile in terms of the benchmarks improved. Everything that we didn't target obviously had a slight reduction, but the main point is that if you're doing rendering for hours and hours and hours on this CPU, or you're doing simulation, something like this, where you're just letting it go, you are saving a lot in terms of the power, you're saving a lot in the terms of what you have to spend on cooling, whilst actually getting more performance. And obviously, in all honesty, you don't need as high a PSU either, and it's going to also help the longevity of the VRM on the motherboard and all these kind of things by pulling such an amount less power and staying a lot less in terms of temperatures. Okay, so finally, what's the 8-pack conclusion on this product? Who is this CPU for? Well, in stock, guys, it's for enthusiasts and gamers with a custom water cooling loop, or want the absolute maximum performance that Intel has to offer. It's also, of course, for overclockers who are willing to do a little bit of tweaking, tuning, to extract every little degree of performance out of the CPU. Or, of course, they can buy an 8-pack bundle and we'll do the same, and all you have to do is install it within your case. Will I be using this CPU in 8-pack bundles and systems? Of course I will, and as I've suggested, we'll be upgrading my bundles to include this CPU with a variety of profiles. So you, if you don't want to do the overclocking yourself, can buy a pre-configured bundle. Also, with this being the best CPU Intel has to offer, it will go into my system at launch, just so that we can say we have the flagship product and the absolute best performance. And again, 8-pack systems will come with the 2 profiles, so the end user can switch between them. And there is a video on our YouTube channel, link in the description below, that tells you the details of how to switch the profiles. And it is indeed pretty easy. With a few keystrokes, you can switch the profile for the particular task that you're going to undertake, the next time you boot the system. I guess the main things other than that to say about the CPU is that you are paying quite a percentage extra for only a very small percentage in improvement over indeed the 14900K or even the 13900KS. And that's really the main, if you like, negative point about the CPU. It won't be for everyone, of course, but if you are new to Z790 and you are new to Intel, this 1700 socket, then you'd probably want to buy this CPU if you are looking for the absolute elite tier performance. And finally, of course, in true 8-pack style, don't like the video, don't subscribe to mine or Overclockers socials, and certainly don't subscribe to this channel. But do, of course, buy my bundles. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-pack, the resident professional overclocker here at Overclockers UK. Each year around this time, for Computex, we bring a new revolutionary state-of-the-art system that's going to absolutely smash everything else on the market. For last year's show, we produced the Dominate, which redefined everything in the power performance benchmark. This year, I have a new system behind me here. This is the Supernova Mark III, and again, it's designed to absolutely smash the competition in all benchmarking and all applications. Here on this video, I'm going to tell you the top 8 things about the system behind me. So, that being said, let's get into it. Okay, point 1, the one CPU to rule them all. and that's the 7995WX CPU by AMD. Now this mammoth CPU gives you 96 cores of performance with the possibility of 192 threads. It can run AVX2 and AVX 512, no problem. Here, obviously, we're water cooling it and we're overclocking it, and that can smash every single workload, such as rendering, AI, simulation, and blah, blah, blah. Point 2. And point 2 is motherboard and memory. For the ultimate CPU, we have the ultimate motherboard. And this motherboard is no exception to the rule. We've got Asus WRX90 Sage motherboard, which supports up to 7 GPUs, has onboard BMC for remote management, and crazy power delivery, so you can extract the best out of the hardware that you place in it. Plus all that, it's got built-in overclocking, and manual overclocking too, which we'll get into a bit later. So it's a very solid platform in terms of power delivery and function. The memory we're using in here is 512 gig of Kingston 5600 MHz RDIMM, which is absolutely ultra rock stable and operating at nice cool temperatures even when you stress it. Now obviously that kind of capacity is going to be able to handle pretty much any task, and 5600 MHz in octa channel configuration gives you a huge amount of bandwidth. Other options for memory on this particular platform is you can go all the way up to 4 terabytes if you wish, or trimming it down, you can go for something like 128 gig at 6000 MHz should you require that kind of option. Point 3. Speaking of 7 PCI Express slots and a load of lanes on that CPU, we're going to fill it all up. And for that, we've got 7 4090s by NVIDIA. These GPUs can literally churn through absolutely any rendering, AI, or simulation task you throw at them. And obviously, they give you an absolute mammoth amount of VRAM, should you want to use it. So, on this particular system, that's where a huge chunk of your cache is going. Point 4. Point 4 is overclocking. And we wouldn't be Overclockers UK if we're not doing some overclocking. And this CPU has loads of headroom. So, we're taking all 96 cores and pushing them to 4.5 gigahertz across every single core for every single workload, no matter what you throw at it. And this boosts the performance over stock to a remarkable 45%, which is pretty damn good. On the GPUs, we're doing something similar. We're pushing up the core of the GPUs to just short of 3000 megahertz on all 7. And we're pushing each card to plus 400 or plus 500 on the memory, depending on what's available within the card. So, all that overclocking gives you a lot more productivity in your tasks, whatever you're doing. Point 5, and that's power. Now, all that overclocking is going to need some serious power. And in this machine, we've got a lot of it. We've got 2 1600 watt ROG 4 titaniums and an additional SFX, which is an 850 watt unit. So that's crazy power, well over 4000 watts. With the PSUs, we haven't done anything by half measures either. We've given them all their own custom cables, specially made for us by Cable Mod, just to give it that really crisp finishing touch. Point 6 is the rad cooling. And speaking of rads, this system's got 3 of them. It's got a 480 in the front, it's got a 480 in the bottom, and it's got a 420 in the top. And of course, you need all this radiator space to exhaust all this massive power. Also in terms of cooling, we've got dual pump arrangement, Y2 pumps. Well, that equalizes the pressure of the fluid throughout the system and also leads to redundancy if there's ever a problem with the pump. We've got specifically made customized distro plates for this unit, both in polished aluminium here in the base, here in the top, which are totally custom. You ain't getting this off the shelf. We've got specifically designed GPU blocks and CPU blocks by Nexalus, which of course are single slot to allow us to fit this amount of cards into the system. And the CPU block is unique as it has 2 inlets, 2 outlets for better flow and better temperatures. Finally, all the GPUs and the CPU are all on quick connects, which means that maintenance for the system and upgradability can be done in literally seconds. Point 7, and I hope you're remembering all this, because this system can remember everything. It's got 2 4TB NVMe drives in there, as standard. There's a Western Digital SN850Xs, and it's also got 2 8TB SSDs. That's enough storage for pretty much everyone. But should you want to add more, give us a call, we'll customize it. Finally, point 8. Point 8 is this massive Lian Li V3000 Plus case that we've got here. It's polished aluminium, Looks really sleek and really professional. Obviously, in general, we're not going to put RGB on this, but for launch, we've had to add a little bit of white, just so you can see it. So in terms of customization, as you can see here, we've got our logos, 8-pack, Render, Asus, and Overclockers. But you can have anything up there. And indeed, you can have anything throughout the system. So we can change, if you wish, the colour of the cables, the colour of the braided tubing, and indeed, of course, this braid you can get in pretty much anything. So we can switch out the colours all around, the colour of the fittings as well, up to a point. I mean, quick connects, they don't come in many colours other than black and silver. So I'd probably keep them black or silver. Okay, finally, the 8-pack range is about extreme performance, extreme overclocking, and some cool, crazy look. And my Supernova Mark III doesn't disappoint on any level. If you want to follow more about the Supernova Mark III, or even get your wallets out and buy one, check out the link in the description below, as it'll be listed on Overclocker's website. Finally, as always, don't like the video, don't subscribe to our channels, but do check out my 7-pack of GPUs here. Oh, and one interesting fact, this system weighs 70 kilos, maybe even a bit more, but don't worry, I can rep it easy. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-pack, jack of all trades and master of absolutely every single one of them. One of those is of course overclocking. Well, now I've finished massaging my ego a bit, let's get into the point of this video. In this video, we're looking at AMD Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. And more specifically, I'm going to do a mini review in this video of the 9700X CPU. And within the video, we'll be covering the stock performance, memory performance, and then of course, more importantly, overclocking and how to keep the CPU cool and what the overall power draw is. So that all being said, let's get into it. The 9700X is Granite Ridge architecture, which is Zen 5. It has 8 cores with 16 threads because each core is hyper-threaded. And that's exactly the same as the previous generation in terms of the core allocation as the 7700X. The clock frequency of the CPU has a base frequency of 3.8 GHz with a turbo frequency on one core of 5.5 GHz. This CPU plugs into any AM5 socket motherboard, which AMD have said they'll support up to 2027. Now, to get the best out of the latest CPUs, these 9th generation CPUs, you have to update the BIOS on your motherboard to the latest AGISA code, and that will give you the correct boost, frequencies, and so on, and the correct performance. I have to say, when I was testing this CPU at stock, I never saw as lower frequencies, no matter what I've run, as the 3.8 GHz base. And in general, if you run heavy multi-core threading on this CPU at stock, I saw around 4.8 GHz, 4.7 GHz, something like that. And then under gaming or single core style lower workloads, I saw around 5.3 to 5.4 GHz. When testing this 9700X, I used my standard AMD testing platform, and for that I used the Asus X670E ROG Hero motherboard that we have on the desk here next to me. That was on the latest BIOS. I added to that 32 gig, 2x16 gig of 5200 MHz memory for all the stock testing. The GPU I use is NVIDIA 4090. And the cooler for this particular CPU, as its low heat output, decided to use a 240 AIO by Acertech. Obviously, I did want to explore at a later stage in the video if memory speed would affect the performance or how much it would affect the performance. I also, at one stage, threw in the 2x16 of 7600 MHz memory as well to check that. As far as operating system, I was on the latest version of Windows 11 on Western Digital NVMe. Finally, I obviously updated the NVIDIA drivers and the chipset drivers as well as the BIOS to make sure I was getting the absolute top performance out of this CPU and I could really do a fair review for you, the viewers. So initially, let's talk about the cooling and power draw at totally stock. And when I say stock, all I mean is you boot up the system, load the DOCP or the XMP or the Expo profile of the memory. So that's run at 15200 and that's all. Then reboot into Windows without adjusting anything. So completely stock apart from the memory set at its profile. What I noticed initially was that the TDP was much lower than the 7000 series, with a 65 watt TDP versus 105 watt TDP on the 7700X. And this is obviously because of the architectural improvements that have made everything a lot more power efficient. And obviously, with the power efficiency, you get improvements in cooler efficiency because the cooler's not having to remove as much heat. So under full load, which was my usual load test, which is Blender, absolutely maxed out for a period of a couple of hours. Under full load, this CPU was only drawing a maximum of 88 watts, which I thought was a very, very low and very, very good result. And the max temperature I saw at stock was only 60 degrees, which again was crazy low. These results made this particular 9700X, when compared to the 7700X CPU, was actually 34% cooler at complete stock, with the 7700X going as far as 90 degrees on the same cooling in the completely same system, which means that this 9700X CPU may well be very good in more compact builds or even ITX systems, and it may also be pretty good with air cooling, if indeed the customer wants to keep the build incredibly compact. Like I said, I didn't have a chance to test out every single cooler on the market in this review. I just tested what is my standard cooler for this kind of CPU, the 240AIO, and I did find a really large improvement of 34%, which is well done to AMD. And also, with this 34% improvement in cooling, we saw a less power draw, 42% under load, with only a maximum of 88 watts compared to a maximum under the same load of 125 watts on the 7700X, which obviously means lower energy bills, which obviously being 8-pack I don't care about, but it also means that maybe you can get away with a slightly lesser PSU to run the overall system. I mean, I was using my standard 8-pack 2000 watt PSU to run this, so obviously I had massive headroom to run pretty much any system. But someone who is picking a mid-end GPU plus the CPU may well now be able to get away with like 500 watts, which I think is a good saving in power. So, having done all this stock testing, the 7700X versus the 9700X, what were the results? Well, firstly, I'd like to point out that the frequency of the 9700X remained higher for longer when compared to in any test than the 7700X, and this was obviously because the CPU was running cooler, and any modern CPU boosts as high as it possibly can in line with the TDP and also the heat output. So our OCUK Blender render test took 1 hour 54 minutes on the 9700X, which was a 25% improvement on the previous gen. 3D Mark Firestrike Physics was up 9.6% better. 3D Mark Firestrike graphics test was 4.6% improvement, and the 3D Mark CPU profile was in all a 4.6% improvement. 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme, which is a test with heavy tessellation and heavy graphics detail, showed only a 2.4% improvement. And I would expect that because obviously when you're running a test such that the bottleneck is effective, the GPU, the CPU is going to play less of a role in impacting the overall improvement. In Cinebench R23 multi-core, we saw an 8.3% improvement. In single core, we saw an 11.7% improvement. In Cinebench 2024 multi-core, we saw a 7.8% improvement. In Corona 1.3, we saw a 3.5% improvement. And finally, in superposition, which I ran at 1080p medium settings to emphasize the CPU bottleneck on such a system, we saw a massive 28% improvement. So overall, the increase generation on generation when comparing one CPU to the other was 10.5% on average, while also using, obviously, as I mentioned before, quite a lot less power, creating a lot less heat, and obviously able to accept probably a lower PSU and a lower cooler should the end user want to choose that. And I can also say that the benchmarks that I've just read out, the ones that really emphasize CPU power, such as really heavy rendering or really heavy multi-core stuff, then the generational improvement was more than 10%. It was more closer to 15%. So well done to AMD for that. And let's see now how we can improve these results by a bit of overclocking. Okay, for overclocking results then, what I decided to do essentially was two different types of overclocking. One which was to use the PBO2 algorithm for overclocking, and the other one was to do a static manual overclock, and obviously pull the results for all the benchmarks that we've just run on the stock and see how the improvements went. So for the PBO2 overclocking, basically I set the limits of the frequency to what the manufacturer of the board would suggest. I boosted the CPU 200 megahertz and I set a negative frequency curve of -10 to gain these results. And I found that the CPU ran very stable at -10 without any problems, and did indeed boost to a higher level than advertised on the tin, if you like. So what was the improvement by using this PBO2 tuning versus stock? Our OC UK blender test now had a 10% improvement. Our 3D Mark Firestrike physics was 5.6% improvement. Firestrike graphics, 2.7% improvement. 3D Mark CPU profile, 11.4% improvement. TimeSpy Extreme, 0.1% improvement. Cinebench multi-core, 12.1% improvement. Cinebench R23 single core, 2.4%. Cinebench 2024, 7.3% improvement. We also saw in Corona 1.3 a 4.7% improvement. And finally, in Superposition 1080p, we saw a 0.9% improvement. So what this really showed us that with PBO tuning, you get an overall increase over stock of about 5.7% when you're averaging out all those benchmarks. Now, if you look at the benchmarks that are massively multi-cored, such as the Blender or the Cinebenches of the world, that are really relying on the frequency maintaining high for longer, and it's making use of all the cores and all the threads, the overall increase in performance with PBO2 is closer to 10%, which I think for PBO2, where you're making very limited settings and not doing loads and loads of testing, once you've made those settings, is quite a decent improvement. But like I said, the negative of that is you do definitely need a better cooler. You need to make sure you're on a 240 IO, and you are going to take a hit in terms of the power draw. We can now discuss what was the improvement of manual overclocking versus stock. For the manual overclocking, obviously, I did a traditional approach of setting the voltage, setting frequency via the core ratio, making sure all the cores are running at the same speed, and then checking the temperatures, the stability and the power draw. And what we saw in this was that our Blender render test had an 11.6% improvement. 3D Mark physics on Firestrike was 5.2. Firestrike graphics was a 3% improvement. 3D Mark CPU profile, an 11.1% improvement. TimeSpy Extreme was a 0.1% improvement. Cinebench R23 multi-core was 13.7% improvement. Single core on R23 was 2.4% improvement. Cinebench 2024 was an 8.4% improvement. Corona 1.3, which is again a rendering test, was a 4.7% improvement. And finally, on Superposition, we saw a 1.6% improvement. So overall, above stock, our manual overclocking result gave us a 6.2% overall improvement. Again, when you average out across the entire benches that we've done there. With both of these types of tuning, it actually meant a 70% more power draw to get this more performance. However, the temps were still pretty good, but if you do want to overclock, I would suggest that you do, in this case, choose an IO cooler, because now we were pushing up in the late 80 degrees C range when we were doing our very heavy blender test and some of the very heavy multi-core testing. So obviously the main trade-off for the extra performance, as you'd expect with any type of overclocking, is it's going to cost you in both power draw and temperatures. But with this new architecture, because effectively the removal of the heat is so efficient, then you're not pushing into dangerous temperature territories to gain this extra performance. But if you compare our manual overclocking with what PBO2 was doing and what stock was doing on the very, very CPU limited, very heavy CPU loaded benchmarks, that was a better result of about 12%. So again, just the same as PBO2. Your 12% improvement is a solid gain, but obviously you're taking a hit in terms of the heat output and the power draw, which obviously as an end user, it really does depend how you want to tune the particular CPU to get the best out of it for your individual needs. Obviously, I would be going turbo on. So after doing all this core frequency testing, I also wanted to check out the memory performance and the memory overclocking stroke versus performance of the new CPUs. I wanted to check it out myself how higher frequency kits do work with the new CPU. And what I did found, plug and play with DOCP enabled, a 7600 MHz kit booted and worked absolutely fine, completely stable in 2x16GB format. And that ran absolutely my entire benchmark suite to give us some results. Now, the results you're going to see on the screen in a minute or two are those that were collated across the entire benchmark suite with my PBO2 settings. So the CPU wasn't at stock, it was at the PBO2 settings that I described earlier in the video with the 7600 MHz memory. So those results are going to be on the screen now. And what you'll see from those results is that, interestingly, the 7600 MHz memory only made about 1.5% difference across all the benchmarks that I tested, which is probably within margin for error of the benchmarks and certainly not worth the end user buying the 7600 MHz kit above something like 5200 MHz. And I believe the problem here is obviously the infinity fabric of the CPU, or the divider that it runs the memory clock at, is essentially over 6000 MHz running on a divider instead of a one-to-one with the frequency of the RAM. And that's what's, if you like, limiting the performance of the higher speed memory. So what I would probably suggest here is, if you want to pick a higher memory speed above 5200, then pick something around the 6000 mark, and certainly not above 6000, which is not going to be more expensive really than 5200, but will give you maybe a slight bit extra performance. Obviously also a lot of my customers are running 128 gig of memory when they're running business applications. So I wanted to check this 4DIMM population, and I did find in 4DIMM mode I had no problem running 400 MHz memory, so above the 3600 MHz that AMD suggests is possible, but not by a great deal. But I didn't think in testing that the 4400 MHz actually made that much difference when compared to 5200 MHz either. And certainly the memory speed overall wasn't holding back the performance of this CPU, which I guess is great news for those who have got these lower speed memory kits already and are just looking to upgrade the CPU. So what's the conclusion to this review? This CPU is a great CPU in terms of affordable gaming, and it's also good for content creation. It's a really good improvement generation on generation when compared to the 7700X, averaging out at stock performance of a 10% improvement. And like I said, if you're actually boiling it down to the benchmarks that really churn out the information on giving you a better CPU, so the multi-core stuff, it's more closer to a 15% improvement generation on generation. So well done to AMD. This 9700X obviously is not the flagship product in this range, so I won't personally be doing any bundles with this CPU, but we will be including this CPU in our pre-built systems and obviously also on our configurator. So anyone who wants to buy this system in a pre-build or in a system built by Overclockers, of course you can do, and it is great in this area, if you like, of mid-tier or affordable gaming or content creation. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8Pack, the king of overclocking and the best reason to watch YouTube. Today I'm going to be reviewing the AMD 9900X CPU, and yes, it's over 9,000! What I'm going to be covering about this CPU is the stock performance versus the previous generation, about thermals of the CPU so everyone knows what cooler to use, a bit about the power draw, and of course how to overclock and tune the CPU to get the best out of it, and what results you get from tuning. So, all that being said, let's get into it. So firstly, I need to point out at the time of filming, we didn't have any 9950X in stock, so I couldn't test the particular flagship CPU in this range. We did, however, have 9900X CPUs in stock, and that's going to be the subject of this video. The 9900X is the same architecture as the 9700X, which I tested in a previous video. If you want to check that out, that's in the description below. The architecture is Granite Reg Zen 5. It has 12 cores and 24 threads, which is the exact same as the previous generation 7900X. The base clock of this CPU is 4.4 GHz with a turbo boost of up to 5.6 GHz on one core. But often, the one core turbo is reached by several cores depending on what type of tuning you use. This particular CPU can go in any AM5 motherboard with the latest Giza code, which will be within a BIOS update. So basically, these CPUs are compatible with any AM5 motherboard, providing you update your BIOS. So, what's the memory support on the new 9 series CPUs? The 9900X, when you populate two memory channels, gives you 5600 MHz memory support as stock. If you populate all 4 DIMM slots, this drops to 3600 MHz. This is a slight improvement on the previous generation, where with the 7900X with 2 DIMM population, the memory support was up to 5200 MHz. So essentially you've got 400 more megahertz of official support for memory speed when 2 DIMMs are populated. When 4 DIMMs are populated, both generations offer 3600 MHz memory. As well as this improvement in speed, or slight improvement in speed, the new platform stroke the new CPUs offer extra memory capacity officially supported, with up to 196 GB now officially supported on the new CPU versus 128 GB officially supported on the older generation CPU. I can also say that on the older generation CPU, we here at Overclockers had no problem getting 196 GB working with a bit of tuning in the BIOS. But it's nice to know that AMD have officially now supported that, and motherboards will add these 196 GB modules to their QVL lists. In testing, I tested all the way from 5200 MHz memory in dual channel, all the way up to 7600 MHz memory in dual channel, and found that the statistical improvement in performance was negligible, or almost nothing. So this suggests to me that you don't really need to spend extra on memory for this particular platform, and you'd probably be better putting the investment into cooling, which we'll discuss a little bit later. This all being said, you can roughly say that memory support hasn't really been improved a lot with this generation of CPUs. You've got a little bit of extra speed on stock, but that could have been reached anyway. No further 4 DIMM support. And also you've got a little bit of extra capacity, but that capacity was working fine with tuning on the previous gen. All that being said, what was the system I used to test all these different configurations? The motherboard I used was an Asus X670E Hero board on the latest BIOS with the latest Giza code supporting this particular CPU generation. The memory I used for all my testing, having deduced that memory speed didn't really make much difference, was a 5600 MHz Corsair kit with a cast latency standard at 36. The GPU I used was my standard 4090, which is a ROG Strix. And the cooler I used for this particular testing was a 360mm AIO by EK. My OS was on the standard Western Digital 850 SN850X CPU, Windows 11 installed with the latest chipset drivers, obviously the latest GPU driver, and anything I could use and update to try to get as much as I could out of the CPU. So updated the Windows as well up to the current levels. So let's now talk a little bit about cooling and power draw at completely stock settings when tested against the previous gen CPU. AMD quoted 120 watts TDP for the new CPU and 170 watts for the older CPU, the 7900X. I can confirm that under stock maximum testing loads, of which I used a Blender rendering test, I saw 30% less power draw under load on the new generation, which pulled 162 watts compared to 210 watts on the 7900X. Like I say, that's a 30% drop in power draw, and what this led to effectively was a 35% cooler maximal running temperature, which on this particular CPU I only saw 69 degrees, which is a very, very good result, versus 93 degrees C on the same cooler using the previous gen CPU, the 7900X. So obviously this reduction in power and reduction in temperatures is brought about by the change of architecture to a much more power efficient design, if you like. And obviously this leads to being able to, when you're speccing your PC, to be able to choose a slightly lower PSU, maybe also choose a slightly lower cooler. Although if you are going to tune this CPU, I would still suggest a 360 IO, but for stock, a 240 IO would certainly be totally fine. And also, of course, and I can't believe I'm even saying this, you'd save a few pence on your energy bills if you bothered about 10 or 15p here and there. So, what were the stock results when comparing the 7900X to the 9900X when running my full range of benchmarks, which include things like Blender, Corona Bench, Cinebench, and so on and so on. It's the standard stuff that you've all seen before and you complain about because I don't do enough game benchmarking. But at the end of the day, I'm a benchmarker. I just want to run synthetics. All right, so what was the improvement generation on generation at totally stock? And when I say stock, I mean literally go in the BIOS after boot up and just set the DOCP or the XMP of the memory, go into Windows and run the benchmarks. What we saw essentially is generation on generation, averaging out the entire benchmark suite, we saw an 8.8% improvement of the 9900X versus 7900X. If you remove all the GPU bottleneck benchmarks, we saw a 12% improvement on the 9900X versus 7900X. And obviously, all these results were using less power draw and giving us much less temperature as well to deal with at the cooler end. Now we've gone through the stock results. What were the overclocking and tuning results? Well, for this section, I decided to do the usual when looking at AMD CPUs, which was to do a PBO2 tuning profile and a manual overclocking profile. Now, the PBO2 tuning profile I did was I set the motherboard as the limit. So the power distribution of the motherboard was going to be the limit. I set a negative curve, -12. And obviously I set the CPU where possible, given temperature, to boost 200 megahertz above what you would expect from the normal stock profile. The results of this essentially were not as big as we've seen on other generations of CPU, or other, not just generations, but other market sectors, if you like. For example, the previous generation of Ryzen CPUs, you could easily extract 20% extra by doing this kind of thing on your performance benchmarks. Or on Threadripper, you could even extract up to 35 or 40% on a 96 core Threadripper. Here, PBO2 tuning was using an extra 50% of power over stock. It was getting much hotter than stock, all the way up to 93 degrees C. And the improvement over my extended benchmarking suite was only 2.4%, as the graphs that are on the screen now will show you. On the overclocking or manual overclocking profile, basically I set an overclock of 5.3 gigahertz no matter what load was placed on the CPU. My manual overclocking, this also gave quite considerably extra power usage, although less than PBO2, and did give more temperature, although this was well within the acceptable range at mid-80s, again than stock, but also yielded only 1.8% better performance over stock performance. Now obviously, with both of these, again, just like we did with stock, if you select only the certain benchmarks that are CPU limited, you can get a bit more performance. So maybe PBO can give you a maximum of like 4 to 5%, and maybe standard overclocking or fixed overclocking can give you an improvement of up to 4%, but still not as big a result, like I say, as on the high-end desktop platform or previous generations of Ryzen CPU. So my advice for this would be, if you really want to tune the CPU and get the absolute last few percent out of it, then do PBO2, do a manual overclock, or combine the both with switcher, which for me was the absolute best idea with this CPU if I wanted to tune it for ultimate performance. The manual overclocking profile basically saw a maximum of 85 degrees C and a power draw of 210 watts. The PBO2 tuning profile gave a maximum temperature of 93 C with a maximum power draw of 246 watts. Obviously, these temperatures on the PBO2 tuning, I thought over 90 was a little bit too high for my liking on this particular architecture. So I also tried testing a switcher profile, which I would advise was the best profile overall that I tried, because you got the benefits of both types of overclocking, the manual and the PBO2 tuning. This basically meant that you got the PBO2 performance, if you like, but the cooler temperatures when doing multi-core tasks of the manual overclock. So a best of both worlds. And for that, I set the switcher to switch between PBO2 and manual at around 90 amps for anyone who wants to copy my settings. So, in conclusion, who is this CPU for? Well, this CPU is for your high-end gamers, high-end professional users who are doing Photoshop, rendering, simulation, product design, all these kind of use cases which are great in single core mode and great in multi-core mode. This CPU can satisfy all those segments. It's really a very good generational improvement over the previous generation, yielding, if you pick the CPU bottleneck benchmarks, around 12% improvement. At the same time, obviously, you're saving plenty of power, which also translates into lower temperatures. Again, which will obviously prolong the life of the silicon, which is great, but also gives you extra headroom when, in terms of choosing your cooling. You can scale down your cooling a bit now if you want to a 240 IO, or maybe even a good air cooler for this CPU, whereas the previous generation really demanded a 360 AIO or the real elite standard of air cooler. This CPU, of course, is indeed 8-pack approved, and therefore this and the 9950X will be integrated into my range of systems, the 8-pack range and indeed the Infinite range. So please check out our website for the systems that are using this new series of CPU. And of course, we will also offer this generation of CPUs in our render offerings, which are for a professional user who is going to be looking at doing rendering, simulation, etc. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-pack. The best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Thanks to you keyboard warriors asking for benchmarks on my Supernova system, marketing have been really on my case about it. In response to them, here we go. With some Supernova Mark III benchmarks. Yep, we're going to do CPU stuff, we're going to do GPU stuff, we're even going to do some gaming. Right, all that being said, let's get into it. Let's quickly refresh the hardware in this Supernova Mark III. We've got a 96-core Threadripper CPU, overclocked to 4.4 on all the cores for all workloads. We've got 7 4090 GPUs by NVIDIA. They're also overclocked, where we're adding about 100 MHz to the core of the GPU and 300 to 500 MHz to the memory. This means that the GPUs are boosting consistently to well over 2900 MHz, yes, on all 7. This overclocking is enabled obviously by keeping the GPUs and the CPU to a very low temperature. And to achieve this, we've got custom water cooling throughout the system. Most of it's made by Nextless, and some of it is also custom made parts here at Overclockers. You can't buy this system off the shelf, you have to come to us. Before we benchmark this system, let's explain a little bit about our procedures. This system here next to me has gone through actually many weeks of testing to ensure its absolute stability in anything the customer might choose to run. Okay, that being said, now let's go into the benchmarks and try and break some world records. The first benchmark I tried on this system after doing our stability testing was Cinebench. So let's run the benchmark and see how this system fared. So that's Cinebench complete. What were the scores? Well, Cinebench on CPU alone was 5.5K, a pretty solid result with 96 cores. And Cinebench run on all 7 GPUs gave us over 180K, which is a world record according to HWBot's database of scores. So, not bad for a first benchmark. The second benchmark I'm going to run now is V-Ray. So, let's see how the system fares in that one. Okay, so in V-Ray, on the GPUs alone, we scored 51.7K, which is a record for 7 4090 GPUs. And also, we scored over 202K on the CPU. Next, we'll test the rendering potential of the CPU on Corona 10 and see how that one scores. On this particular benchmark, which is rendering solely on CPU, we managed a massive 42.3K, which is again a world record. It's becoming a bit easy, this world record lap, to be honest. Finally, let's check this system out in Blender. When we're normally testing Blender, we're doing it on CPU only, and an overclocked Ryzen CPU normally gives us a time of about an hour on our CAN test. Well, wait for it. This system, when we run it, which I'm going to do now, produces a pretty good score. So given that a Ryzen CPU overclocked in Blender gives us about an hour result, I wonder how fast the 7 GPUs plus 96 core CPU in this machine can do. Oh, 1 minute 40 seconds. Not half bad, even by 8-pack standards. So that's the workstation benchmarks done. 3 world records, not too bad for a first go. That being said, you're probably wondering what was the power draw while we're running all these benchmarks. Well, when running heavy rendering on CPU and GPU simultaneously, the peak power draw can be up to 3000 watts. And obviously that really just shows the prowess of the cooling to get the full performance out of this system all the time. Because the GPUs, no matter what load you hit them with, average out at about 55 C on every single GPU, with peaks of up to 60. And the standard deviation across the GPUs is usually less than 1 degree C. So every GPU is getting a similar flow rate of similar amounts of cool fluid. The CPU, even massively overclocked and pulling over 900 watts itself, never reaches more than 80 degrees, with the average temperature on that when rendering around 75 degrees. So it's the cooling and of course our skills, or indeed of course my skills, that make this system great. This PC is obviously not meant for gaming, it's a workstation PC. But as you guys asked for it, we've done some gaming benchmarks anyway. What you'll notice about the gaming benchmarks is they're not that great. In fact, they're very similar to a high-end, I would say, gaming machine, especially when you push to 4K. The reason really why they're not screaming like, this is amazing, is because the CPU is 96 cores and gaming is taking use of maybe 6 or 8 cores maximum, and therefore it's not taking use of the power of the CPU. We've got 512 gig of memory in this machine, which obviously, again, gaming is not really making use of any more than 32 gig. And we've got 7 GPUs in this machine, and obviously gaming only can use a maximum of 1, so the scores do not scale whatsoever with the extra 6 GPUs. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to buy this world record-breaking PC, check out the links in the description below. Or obviously contact us directly and we can configure it for you. You can basically have any colour or any configuration that'll fit within the case. But I suggest you pick this one. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-Pack, the king of overclocking, and in fact, the king of pretty much everything. I know you've tuned in today to YouTube to only watch me, and I don't blame you. Right, on to the purpose of this video. In this video, we're going to cover the new X870E motherboards. And within this video, I'm going to cover how these perform on the new 9950X. Well, it's not that new, is it? It's a month old, but this is my video on it, and of course, the definitive guide. And within the video, we're obviously going to cover, as usual, stock performance, PBO tuning, and overclocking. And also, finally, we're going to cover how to tune your memory modules to get the best out of the CPU, and what extra performance can be gained by doing that. So, all that being said, let's dive into it. The 9950X CPU. Let's discuss a bit about it. This CPU, just like the other 9th gen, if you like, AMD CPUs, is Granite Ridge Zen 5 architecture. This particular model, the 9950X, has 16 cores and 32 threads, which is exactly the same as the 7950X from the previous generation. The base clock on this CPU is 4.3 GHz with a single core turbo of up to 5.7 GHz. Now I've noticed in testing that needs an asterisk next to it really, because sometimes it's more than one core, could be 2, 3 or even 4 cores that reaches 5.7 GHz given the different parameters that you set within the motherboard. These CPUs obviously go straight into the AM5 socket that's been out for a while, and AMD have promised to support up to 2027. So, that being said about the CPU, let's now move on to the X870E motherboards. Like I said, the ones I've used for testing are the ASRock Taichi and the Asus Hero next to me on the desk. These boards have a new BIOS which is optimized towards the Zen 5 core architecture, and therefore it's plug and play immediately. These motherboards on X870E also have higher AMD Expo memory speeds supported. Obviously the CPU natively supports up to 5600 MHz, but these boards, obviously not guaranteed, but overclocked conditions can now do 8000 MHz no problem. These motherboards have all the CPU premium overclocking features, so you've got normal PBO, you've got PBO2 with offsets, you've got static overclocks, you've got memory overclocking, and also you've got switcher overclocks, which means you can combine static and PBO type tuning to get the best of both worlds. These boards also have a good array of PCI Express Gen 5 support, and obviously they need this now with the GPU switching to PCI Gen 5, and obviously people are demanding more speed from the NVMe drives, which Gen 5 will offer. These boards come as standard with USB 4 now, which of course was available on X670E, but through an add-on chip. Now these are built into the specification of the boards and therefore has to be supported. This means that we have 40 gig per second throughput and we have Thunderbolt compatibility. If you're a gamer, some of these extra features may not be that useful to you. For example, you may not need Thunderbolt, you might not need USB 4 even, and you may not even want to go to the extra expense of using NVMe 5 drives. However, for the professional, all of these things are indeed useful and can be useful, especially the content creator who's shifting a lot of data around at once. In addition to the X870E and X870 motherboards, eventually, of course, we'll get B850 and B840 chipsets, which will serve the mainstream, or indeed the peasants. Let's jump in to what my test systems were for all the CPU testing that I did. Basically, I used the motherboards we have in front of me, the Tai Chi and the Hero. I used the latest Windows 11 as far as software goes, with all the latest updates in terms of drivers, chipset drivers and so on to optimize for the new AMD CPUs. Because if you remember on launch, Windows Scheduler wasn't working very well with the new CPUs, so I obviously wanted to make sure in this case I had the correct scheduler and the correct update, so all that was updated, including GPU drivers. I also used the 4090 GPU, exactly the same model as I've done all my other testing on. The CPU cooler for this was a 360 AIO by EK. The memory in this test initially started off as being the Corsair 5600 C30 kits for what was my non-tuned memory profiles, if you like, and then I shifted from them to G.Skill 6000 MHz C30 kits for my tuned memory profiles. That memory stuff we'll look into a bit later. Okay, so stock performance when we're comparing the 7750X with the 9950X in terms of cooling and power draw first. Obviously the 9950X has architectural improvements that allow for less power draw. And what we saw, the power draw of the 9950X was 200 watts versus a 231 watts power draw on the 7950X. That meant that the newer CPU, the 9950X, had a 15% less power draw overall. The max temperatures of stock on the 360mm AIO on the 9950X, when running our blender tests for over an hour, was 78 degrees C on the 9950X versus 96 C on the 7950X. So this was a saving of 23% in terms of cooler running temperatures on exactly the same cooler with the exactly same TIM and exactly the same mount. This can explain, you know, the difference in power draw was 15%, but the difference in temperatures is 23%. Obviously shows that the new CPU IHS is also mounted better to the dies and is slicking away the heat from the dies a little bit better than the previous generation. The cooling I would suggest that you use as a minimum with this particular CPU is actually a 360mm AIO, and especially, obviously, if you plan to overclock or do any sort of PBO2 tuning, this kind of thing, you're better with extra cooling. And in fact, if it's possible you can stretch to it and you already have a custom cooling loop, I would add a custom water cooling block just to get the maximum performance potential out of your investment in the CPU. So, what were the stock results of the 9950X when compared to the 7950X through my suite of benchmarks? Yes, I don't run games, so don't bother typing anything about game results in the comments below. Both, of course, were allowed to just boost to their maximum clock speed that they would under absolute stock with no adjustments in the BIOS. The newer CPU boosted to 5.7 GHz. The older CPU managed 5.6 GHz as a maximum clock frequency under stock. So, what were the actual improvements? 3D Mark Firestrike Physics, I saw a 7.8% improvement on the new CPU. 3D Mark CPU Profile, I saw a 3.7% improvement on the new CPU. Cinebench R23 Multi-Core, an 8% improvement. Cinebench R23 Single Core, 14% improvement. Cinebench R24 Multi-Core, a 9.7% improvement. And Superposition at 1080p, a 16.8% improvement. Overall, between these benchmarks, we saw an increase of around 10% generation on generation when comparing the 9950X to the 7950X. All of this, of course, was while using less power and creating less heat, which in my book is a decent generational step forward in terms of basically every metric that we use to compare these CPUs. So power draw is better, temperatures and thermal performance is better, overall performance in everything that I threw at it is better, and interestingly, the performance metrics in terms of gaming, which in this one would be the Superposition 1080p, would get 16.8% improvement, which is a really, really solid result for you gamers out there. So that's all the boring stock stuff out of the way. Now let's look at the overclocking. And as usual, to look at overclocking, I decided to make a manual overclock profile with static overclocking and a PBO2 profile, which is obviously dynamic overclocking. The PBO2 profile on these CPUs had a 3x scaling factor, a negative curve of around -12, and a negative offset of between -0.07 volts and -0.05 volts, just for you nerds who want to copy exactly what I'm doing. Now, let's look at what those different profiles gave us in terms of results. The PBO2 profile, that maxed out at around 5.9 GHz, but during my benchmarks, in terms of temperature, it maxed out at 95C and pulled 295 watts. In terms of PBO2 versus stock, what were the actual improvements for this tuning that we did? 3D Mark Firestrike Physics had a massive 0.6% improvement. 3D Mark CPU Profile had 8.8%. Cinebench R23 had 5.4%. Cinebench Single Core had 0 improvement at all. Wow. Cinebench R24 Multi-Core had 2.3% improvement. Superposition 1080p, 0.5% improvement. Corona 1.3 had actually no improvement at all again. Our Blender rendering test, which usually lasts around an hour, had 4.9% improvement. So the average improvement across all these tests that I ran after doing PBO2 was around 3.7%. I mean, it's free performance, so not a bad result, but again, I wouldn't say an amazing result for all the testing that you have to do to make sure that PBO2 is indeed stable. What was the improvement across my benchmark suite then in the manual overclocking? Well, 3D Mark Firestrike Physics this time improved 1.12%, 3D Mark CPU Profile was up 14.6%, Cinebench R23 Multi-Core was up 13.2%, but the single core result was up nothing at all. Cinebench R24 Multi-Core was up 7.4%, Superposition 1080p was up nothing at all, Corona 1.3 was up 6%, and Blender rendering was up 12.6%. So I guess overall you can say on this one, the static overclock gave you a 7% improvement. So almost double what the PBO2 showed us. I guess this improvement can be explained on the multi-core profile, because on PBO2 you're getting the frequency dropping when you're using massively multi-core stuff to way below 5.3 GHz, whereas on the static overclock, every core is actually at 5350 MHz throughout every test. So you're benefiting there from clock speed versus any other benefits from PBO2, because the clock frequency is dropping right down under PBO2 when you're loading up every single core so hard. The manual overclock was 5350 MHz, and that maxed out at 96C and pulled a total of 304 watts. Now, these which profile you choose will probably depend on what workloads you're doing. So if you're doing heavy rendering or this kind of workload, which is very multi-core, the manual overclock will yield you better results. If you're more of a gamer who's using less than the full core count, or maybe just using 6 to 8 cores, then PBO2 will generally yield better results. With both of these profiles, basically you've got 50% more power draw to get the extra performance. And also obviously temps are much higher, been all the way up to as high as 95 and 96 degrees C, so you have to make sure you have the top tier of cooling to get really good performance out of this type of tuning. So, unlike my usual 8-pack reviews, this time we're going to look also at some memory tuning. I'm going to do this because my 9950X video is a bit late, and I obviously want to give you guys a few tidbits on how you can get a bit more out of these CPUs, because they are actually really good for tuning memory timings. But after a lot of experimentation, you don't get massive improvements, but you certainly do get some. So the kits I used for the tuning profile of this on this memory testing were G.Skill, both 32 gig and 64 gig capacity, obviously 2x16 or 2x32 gig, 6000 megahertz C30 kits as stock. Now, I chose these kits and that frequency because we already tested in a previous video of mine what's the most efficient speed on these CPUs to give you the best performance, and we discovered that was already 6000 megahertz. So basically I got these kits and then I tuned all the timings within the kits at 6000 megahertz to give us the best performance. I have to say, whilst tuning these kits, these motherboards were absolutely excellent and really did respond to all the settings I put in. And I did obviously, as I was pushing the kits harder and harder, see some instability in the memory, but that was nothing to do with the motherboards at all. And adjusting those timings did again bring the memory back to stability. And all the memory kits I did try in these motherboards, even higher capacity kits than 64 gig, in fact I tried all the way up to 192 gig kits, were all working well, and the motherboards were running them stably within the capacity of the CPU or the IMC capability of the CPU. And I do believe that the X870E motherboards are indeed better for tuning memory than the predecessors. So for all this memory testing, I used my PBO2 profile on the motherboards. I did this so that each test would complete a little bit faster, to be honest. And I wanted to see what memory tuning plus PBO would give in terms of results. Given all these tweaks that I did to the memory, both the secondary and the tertiary timings, refresh rates, and all the sub-timings, what were indeed the improvements from running these G.Skill kits at stock voltage. I have to say I didn't adjust the voltage, just stock voltage, but I did change up pretty much all the timings. Let's just look at what the performance gains were. On R23, for example, Cinebench R23, we had a 1.4% improvement. Or on R23 multi-core, we had a 1.6% improvement. On R24, we had a 3.7% improvement. Corona Bench, we had 3% faster. Blender Render was 2.8% faster. 3D Mark CPU Profile was 2.4% faster. Firestrike Graphics was 0.45% faster. Firestrike Physics was 3.3% faster. Superposition at 1080p was 0.9% faster. So the average improvement of memory testing across the entire benchmarks is 2.2% improvement. And if you look at the rendering style benchmarks, such as R24 and Blender Render, we see over 3% and in fact as high as 3.7% improvement. So something definitely worth doing if you're running a test for over an hour, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes faster for your time is a pretty decent improvement. Now, of course, if you add this memory improvement on top of PBO tuning, we've then got a 5.9% improvement on average, which is better than stock 9950X. And this is a full 12.2% better than on the previous generation of 7950X. So if you've got the cooling and the power, it is worth pushing the CPUs a little bit extra to get the better performance out of them, especially if you want to get the highest frame rates in your games, or indeed complete your rendering tasks or any other such multi-core task as fast as possible and then move on to the next workstation task. So what's my conclusion on the motherboards and the 9950X? My experience with these two motherboards here on the desk was actually absolutely excellent. I had no problem with them running high memory capacity, low latency memory, changing the timings, tuning with PBO, tuning with static overclocking, tuning with a switcher type overclock where you get the best out of both worlds. Both behaved very well across every single benchmark and in terms of stability. So I can recommend both these boards. The CPU, I believe, is a solid leap when you consider the performance of the last generation compared to this. So generation on generation, it's a good solid improvement, and it does offer the tweaker a lot of opportunities to tweak the memory and tweak all the different overclocking settings that you get within these motherboards. So following that conclusion, you can tell I'm going to be using both of these motherboards in 8-pack and Infinite systems moving forward. The Chi here on my left is going to be going into an Infinite Sanctuary system, and the Hero on my right is going to be going into the 8-pack CryoCube system. Of course, with both of those systems, we'll have options of CPUs, the 9950X that you can see in the review here, or we'll be using the 9900X, or indeed the new X3D chips when they eventually come out, if people want to really focus solely on gaming. As well as putting these in our systems, we will be also making upgrade bundles with these CPUs and indeed that memory combination and that memory timings. So if you want us to do all the hard work for you and you just install this as a bundle into your system with all the 8-pack enhancements that I've discussed in the video, please do buy the bundles, and those will be linked in the description below. Right, finally, and as always, please don't like the video, don't subscribe to our channel, don't like my socials, or indeed any of Overclockers' socials. Hello Overclockers, I'm 8-pack, the only reason to watch YouTube, and the king of overclocking. Today I'm going to be reviewing the new Intel Core Ultra 9 285K CPU. Yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful, even for someone with a big gob like me, but this is going to be the Ultra 8-pack review. And in this review, I'm going to be covering, as always, benchmark testing of the CPU at stock, the CPU at overclocking, and what we're going to look at, of course, is performance gains and indeed temperatures and power usage under all these different conditions. So, is this CPU going to be a stone cold stunner or a rock bottom? Let's have a look and find out. So, let's discuss a little bit about the new CPU. Yes, the name's a bit of a mouthful. Intel Core Ultra 9 285K. This new naming scheme is going to go forward with each new generation of Intel CPU, so we're going to have to get used to it. This is due to Intel swapping from a monolithic chip design to a multi-tile based CPU architecture. This CPU has 8 P cores, none of them featuring hyperthreading, and 16 E cores. The max turbo boost on one core of these CPUs is 5.7 GHz on the P core. But actually, in most of my testing at stock, I found that the cores in general, especially with all-core loads, were reaching a maximum of around 5.3 GHz, with only really 5.7 GHz being reached by one core when the system is just kind of idling on desktop. So I wouldn't say it's particularly a usable 5.7. I would say it's a usable 5.3. These CPUs also have now an integrated neural processing unit, also known as NPU, which is good for AI processing. Now I have to say I didn't really test this because there's very few benchmarks that allow me to currently, and I didn't really want to start installing Linux, etc., just to particularly test that feature when, let's be honest, most of the people watching this video don't care about AI at all. The actual process name is known as Arrow Lake, and it sits in a brand new socket for Intel, which is LGA 1851 or Z890 motherboards is the title. The new motherboards for this CPU feature certain new technologies as well. This includes DisplayPort 2.1 and HDMI 2.1 onboard VGA, which of course most users from here are not going to be using onboard VGA, but I guess it's a nice upgrade if you are. The CPU also has up to 20 PCI Express 5.0 lanes from the CPU. The idea of this being, of course, that if you run a GPU that's working on PCI Express 5 and you run an NVMe drive as well, that you don't sacrifice bandwidth to the GPU. So that's why, of course, that they've done that. These motherboards also feature Thunderbolt 5 and Wi-Fi 7 support. They all also have 2.5 gigabyte internet and support memory speeds up to a whopping 9600 megahertz DDR5. And we'll do a bit of testing on memory a bit later on, all the way up to 8400, to see if this memory is giving positive effects. As you can see from in front of me, there's a range of different boards available on Z890 as per usual. In my testing, I specifically focused on the Asus Apex here on my left and the SX Extreme here on my right. In testing, both of them performed flawlessly and did improve in terms of performance with BIOS updates that I was given regularly by Asus, who support me on this. Thank you to Asus. I can also say that obviously the look of the new boards is great for different builds. This board here would fit obviously with a white or monochrome style of colour scheme, or the Extreme here would fit great in a black system. The Extreme here also has a very large LCD screen here on the I/O, which particularly does look good in a system with a windowed side panel. So again, I really like the designs of the boards, and the features are actually useful all the way to the memory overclocking. So what was my test system for all the results that you're going to see in the future of this video? Like I said, I used either one or both of these motherboards for testing. What I've done in terms of the performance scores that you'll see, they're on the latest BIOS that was available when we shot this video. And obviously, I can't guarantee that these results will be absolutely perfect when the video comes out, because again, there may be more BIOS revisions. The Windows I used was Windows 11, updated to the latest version I could find online, and the latest version of the drivers, which again are also, at the time of speaking here, are still in beta version. So again, probably not exactly what you will get if you choose to go this platform and this CPU. But again, I'll give you the best results that I actually managed to get. And I also used the 4090 GPU for testing. Obviously, choosing the 4090 here for all my testing made sure that, especially when we're testing in 1080p with medium or low settings, that we're shifting the entire bottleneck of all the benchmarks to the CPU itself and making sure that the GPU has as little impact as possible on our testing results. The cooling I used for all this testing was either an EK 360mm AIO, which is my standard cooler for this kind of stuff, and then later on I used a Nexus LGA Intel water block to cool the CPU to see if I could get a little bit more out of performance by water cooling it. So, what were the results of testing throughout my usual benchmark suite, which I know I say it every time, doesn't involve a load of gaming, because let's be honest, not everyone just games on the PC. What was the stock performance of this particular CPU versus the previous generation, which is 14900K? What I saw when the BIOS was set to completely stock on both systems was that there was a massive improvement in terms of temperature and power draw on the new CPU, the 285K, versus the 14900K. This equated to a 41% decrease in power draw and a 20% cooler under load. So we're talking 352 watts on the previous generation versus 245 watts on the more recent CPU. The temperatures were swung also pretty wildly from the old generation, maxing out at 100 degrees C when running my blender test for over an hour, versus 79C on the new CPU when running the same blender test on the same cooling. What we saw also in terms of performance results were, in general, the new CPU was 7.8% faster across most of my benchmarks. However, what we did see in Unigen Valley, which was at 1080p extreme settings, that the results had not improved, and in fact statistically were slightly worse generation on generation, given that both CPUs were at complete stock. So what we're talking about here really is that the new generation of CPU is at least the same, if not better in most workloads, but giving us a lot less heat production and a lot less power consumption. So, having completed my stock testing on the new CPU, I decided to do something a little bit different, and that was to now look at, with the new process, how memory speed affects the overall performance of the CPU throughout my benchmarks. For this, I used a 5200 MHz Corsair kit, which was 2x32. I used a 2x16 GB G-Skill kit, which is 6000 MHz, and I used a 2x24 GB G-Skill kit, which is 8400 MHz. So basically, I wanted to see the different speed, 5200 to 6000 to 8400, really affect the results of my performance testing. Now, what I did notice on this was that unlike other generations of Intel CPUs, if you like, or the more recent Intel CPUs, the memory frequency and the IMC didn't run at the same speed. They were run on a divider once you push the memory frequency up on the older CPUs. Whereas on the new CPUs, the memory frequency and the IMC speed actually run one to one, if you like, or synchronously. They used to run asynchronously, now they run synchronously. So I expected a better result, I have to say, from this improvement, if you like, in memory speed. And all I did again was run the same benchmarks. And what I also must say at this point is I also, obviously for our customers who prefer more memory capacity, I tested 128 gig of memory and all the way even up to 196 gig of memory. And now, of course, these capacities of memory did work and they are on the spec to work, but the maximum frequency I could run at with all those sticks installed in the extreme board here to my right was 4000 megahertz, which is pretty much in line with the previous generation of Intel CPU when you basically max out all four of the memory channels. So both channel A and B has dual DIMM population. So in terms of supporting a lot of memory, the new platform does support it. It does work, but you cannot go very high on frequency, certainly not without a lot of tinkering. And basically I was doing plug and play XMP and all this testing. So after all that babble, what was the actual results of the benchmarking? These will come now. Get ready for it. The 5200 megahertz versus 6000 megahertz, we saw a 1% increase in performance for the 6000 megahertz across all my benchmarks. When you're comparing the stock against the 8400 megahertz, I saw a 2.5% increase in performance across the majority of the benchmarks. Now, there was a slight caveat with these benchmarks. The 3D Mark Firestrike physics text, for example, went down as CPU memory frequency scaled up, which is quite unusual, and it went down quite a bit of up to 3.6% on the 8400 megahertz kit, which really was quite strange result for me. But other things such as Cinebench or Blender, they scaled quite well. So I would suggest that just like a lot of applications we use with when we're checking with DDR5, that the faster DDR5 is only useful in certain applications rather than all applications universally. But what we did find here is it was useful in most cases. Like I say, almost all cases apart from 3D Mark Firestrike physics did improve. My recommendations as far as memory kits for this go, if you're looking at 16 gig by 2 memory kits, I would look at something around the 7600 to 8400 megahertz by G.Skill or Team Group. If you're looking at 2 by 48 gig, I would look at G.Skill 8400 megahertz. Both of those kits, or should I say all three of those kits, worked really well. And if you're looking at really high capacities, I'd look at something like Corsair Vengeance, a 5200 megahertz, but then run it at 4000 megahertz. So we've talked a little bit about memory. Now let's go on to what was the overclocking results and how far could we push the CPU. When overclocking this CPU, basically you've got three things you can overclock. The P cores, which of course everyone knows are the performance cores, and they're the things that you're going to leverage most in your single core usage applications. And of course, the more multi-core usage applications, such as gaming, but not massively multi-core applications, such as rendering or simulation. So we can adjust the P-core frequency as before. We can also adjust the E-core frequency before. Now, the E-cores in this particular CPU, on testing, they've really improved the IPC of those, and that's up between 35 and 40% to previous. So overclocking the E-cores now does actually give a massive improvement in multi-core performance and is certainly worth doing for those who want that multi-core performance. And it doesn't limit the overclocking too much on the P-core by overclocking the E-core. So obviously we overclock the E-core as well. And also I suppose this has a few more implications if you're tweaking for gaming. If you're tweaking for gaming, just solely gaming, it might be useful to actually downclock or just leave the E-cores at stock to gain more power envelope from the P-cores. Just food for thought, and certainly something I haven't tested yet. So there's P-cores to overclock, there's E-cores to overclock, and there's cache to overclock. So under AI cooling, I was able to overclock the P-cores to 5.5 gigahertz. I was able to push the E-cores to 4.8 gigahertz and to push the cache to 4 gigahertz. So with 6000 megahertz memory, how did this overclocking stack up in terms of performance? Well, we noted an increase in power draw of 24%. With this, of course, the heat goes up and the heat output went up 17%. And finally, the result was over the benchmarking suite as an average, we got 5 to 6% increase in performance. All the results from the benchmarking are on the screen now. Right, so that was the end of my testing, if you like, or overclocking testing with 6000 megahertz memory. So I now decided to switch to 8400 megahertz memory and a custom water cooling loop, which had a 360mm radiator and the Nexus block installed on the CPU, as you can see on the Apex motherboard. Now, it's interesting to note, of course, that all water blocks that fitted well on the previous Intel Z790 motherboards and socket now also work pretty much fine on the new Arrow Lake CPUs and the Z890 sockets. The mounting hole's the same, and the pressure down on the CPU, even though there is a slight difference in the positioning of the IHS, is still enough to get very good results. And I had absolutely excellent results with the Nexus block that I installed here. So on water cooling with the 8400 megahertz kit set to XMP, I managed now to push the P-cores as high as 5.6 gigahertz. And in fact, you can get those P-cores to reach 5.7 gigahertz as well using water cooling, but it's very CPU dependent. Now, if you do enable TVB at the same time as manual overclocking, the P-cores and tell it to +1 on the core ratio, you can get, under lower loads such as gaming, you can get them to run quite stably on a 5.6 overclock CPU with lower core loading at 5.7. So that's essentially also what I did and what I tested, but that's not included in the results here, but I can confirm to you that it does work. So if you overclock to 5.6, then set up turbo velocity boost to boost by 1 bin. So under lower loads it goes to 5.7, then you will get 5.7 on all the lower loads, loading maybe up to 4 or 5 cores, and it will work stably. I also managed under these conditions with the custom water block, 8400 megahertz memory, get the E-cores now all the way up to 4.9 gigahertz. And at this point, I also tried to push the cache a little bit faster. Now, you could go again on the cache all the way up to 4.2 gigahertz, but again, it was CPU dependent, and I found that 4 gigahertz cache was certainly working on everything. Okay, after all that waffle, what was our actual water-cooled results? Well, what we saw was the exact same increase in power draw as we had on our AIO cooler, and you can speculate that this is because the CPU was kept cooler, so therefore can get extra 100, 200 megahertz because it's cooler in a much more efficient manner, and therefore power draw wouldn't go up. And that absolutely makes sense. And sometimes we see under more extreme cooling scenarios that without even putting more power to the CPU, you can increase the CPU several hundred megahertz. So that all stacks up. What we also saw from, again, stock was an increase in temperature versus stock of 7.6% increase, which of course, when we said on the AIO, the heat went up 17%, then this is quite a good result and proved that custom water cooling really does help push the CPU and does help it cool. Remember on the AIO at 5.5 gigahertz, we saw the heat go up 17%. Now we're on the custom water at 5.6 gigahertz with also more on the P-cores, so therefore more voltage on the P-cores. We only saw a temperature increase of 7.6%. which shows that it's definitely worth custom water cooling if you want to overclock this CPU. And of course, the custom water cooling that I used here worked very well. What were the performance results then for this custom water cooled rig? with the 8400 megahertz? Well, those results are on the screen now. If you don't really want to keep pausing and going through those results to check what it was, I can tell you it was between 6 and 7% improvement. Now, the only anomaly you could say, or the result that's probably worth explaining in a little bit more detail, was the superposition result, which is actually a very good result when you're using a synthetic to compare to gaming. And this did have a massive improvement with overclocking. And obviously you can speculate that this massive improvement in overclocking is basically because the bottleneck is currently the frequency of the P core, and the more you push the P core up, the more this bottleneck's removed, which is what I was wanted to see in the testing. But the jump in this particular benchmark superposition was far in excess of what I saw on all the other benchmarks I ran. So, what are the 8-pack conclusions on this new platform and the Core Ultra 9 CPU? Well, I would say for gaming, and that's been proven out by the benchmarking, is exactly the same performance as the previous gen, or the 14900K CPU. At the same time though, as getting the same gaming performance, you are seeing a very large improvement in terms of power consumption, and a large improvement also in terms of the heat output and the power usage of the system. Also, this CPU is performing way better in any multi-threaded task, such as rendering, of course, if you're gaming and streaming at the same time, or literally anything such as simulation where you need multi-core performance. And Intel have done a great job on improving the IPC of the E-core, which is up between 35 and 40% in my testing, and also the frequency, which was up from around 4 GHz in the previous generation and can now be overclocked all the way up to 4.9 GHz on the new generation. And also, it has a lot of things to tune for the enthusiast to really get to the nitty-gritty and try to get a little bit more performance each time they're tuning. So we can see every time I made a setting, if you like, in the BIOS, the platform was totally stable, which was great. And also, that setting or that change did lead to an improvement in performance. Obviously, also, I like being someone who tweaks memory a little bit. Yeah, I'm not that much of a nerd, but I am a bit of a nerd. That the extra speed of giving a system 8400 megahertz of memory does actually now yield performance, which in previous generations we haven't really seen because the IMC has gone on in a divider. Now that doesn't happen, and the IMC runs synchronously with the memory speed. So well done to Intel for that, and of course, good for us tweakers who want to do a bit of tweaking on the memory and try to extract every little bit of performance. So, will this new CPU be in 8-pack bundles and systems? Of course it will. We'll be bringing everything up to date with a variety of bundles on both AIO and custom water cooling. So, if you want to buy one of those bundles with all the overclocking and all the memory settings done for you, check out the link in the description below. Similarly, we'll be updating all the 8-pack systems and all the Infinite systems. We'll have things like the Polaris updated to this particular platform. We will have Hypercube also updated, as two examples. Right, and finally, and what's become traditional now, do not like the video, do not subscribe to our channel or any of my socials. Hello Overclockers, my name's 8-Pack, King Overclocker, Professional Overclocker, and the Don Corleone of YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the 9800 X3D CPU by AMD. And what I'm going to cover is the stock performance of the CPU, giving the thermals and the power draw, and also some frequency overclocking, PB overclocking, and memory overclocking and tuning. Obviously, this video is about 1 week later than the rest, but you've watched the rest and wasted your time probably, but now you're going to watch the best. So, all that being said, let's watch the best 9800 X3D review. Let's now cover a little bit about the CPU. AMD split the launch of the 9000 series. And this particular CPU, the 9800 X3D, is aimed squarely at the gamers. But to be honest, they've also improved multi-threaded loads from the previous generation too. This CPU's architecture is Granite Ridge Zen 5. It has 8 cores and 16 threads, which is the same as the 7800 X3D from the previous generation. The base clock on this CPU is 4.7 GHz with a boost clock on one core of 5.2 GHz. In fact, I actually found in some testing that the boost clock on one core can be up to 5.4 GHz, which is a bit of a bonus over stock. This particular CPU has several architectural improvements over the previous generation. Rather than adding on the extra L3 cache above the CCD, AMD has put it underneath this time, helping to keep thermals down and clock speeds up, also allowing for overclocking. Now on the previous generation, the only type of overclocking you could do was of PBO2 nature. This time, the entire CPU is overclocked for fun, or can be overclocked for more fun. This CPU fits exactly the same as the previous CPU into any AM5 motherboard with the latest BIOS, and these AM5 motherboards currently available on the market and to come in the future will all be supported up to 2027. So, what was my test system for this 9800 X3D? For the majority of this testing, I used the MSI motherboard here on the desk next to me. This is the X870E Carbon Wi-Fi board, which I found reasonably solid, in fact totally stable throughout my testing for both stock, overclocked and memory tuning, which was really good. The BIOS was fairly intuitive to use, and to be honest, I had really no problem with this board whatsoever from a technical point of view. From a looks point of view, you'll see here, it matches really well with the G.Skill memory that I used for quite a lot of the testing, and it also matched really well with the Corsair memory that I use for my stock testing in terms of look. And also this board would obviously fit well in terms of look in any black coloured or black theme system, or also any monochrome system. So well done to MSI for this board. Like I say, I really enjoyed it and had no problems getting it to work with pretty much anything I tried to do. And it didn't take me a lot of time to get it to work either, which is great. So obviously before I started testing on the board, I did flash it to the latest BIOS, which has the latest Agiza code in it, which takes advantage of all the latest patches on Windows. Now, talking about Windows, I had that installed on a WD850X drive, which I always use. And like I said, I did update that to the latest version, and I updated all the AMD chipset drivers accordingly as well. At the same time, I updated my NVIDIA driver suite as well for the GPU that I was using, which is the usual GPU, the 4090 that I always use, again set at stock with stock driver settings. For my testing at stock and at PBO2 and initial overclocking, I used 5200 MHz Corsair memory, completely set at the XMP mode. And then finally, for my final money shot, if you like, to get the most performance out of the CPU, kind of overclocking, I used the G.Skill 6000 MHz memory with XMP or XPO enabled, yes, but almost all of the sub-timings and even the primary timings were also tuned to really try and extract more from the memory bandwidth. Finally, the cooling that I used for this CPU was only a 240mm Acertec cooler. Now, normally, as everyone will know, I'm usually reviewing higher-end CPUs which put out a lot more heat. This CPU, of course, puts out a lot less heat, has a lower TDP, and I thought to make sure it would test like it was going into a smaller case or a lower powered system, I'd be better to choose a 240mm AIO, and I did that, and I placed on 2 EK fans onto that AIO. So, under stock conditions, now let's talk about the temperatures that the CPU ran at and the power draw. The TDP, as stated on the box, is exactly the same as the 7800 X3D. However, real-world power draw of the new CPU is much higher. Under full load, the 9800 X3D was up at 151 watts, with totally stock settings on the motherboard, apart from Expo enable for the memory. So the max temperatures I saw at stock on the 9800 X3D were 87 degrees C. This made it 58% hotter at stock than 9700X and 14% hotter at stock than the 7800 X3D. More energy and more temperature. Like we just said, 14% more temperature, 71% more power draw. And does this power draw and temperature actually equate into performance? Well, let's have a look at our benchmark results. And as per usual, I won't be doing all that gaming blah 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 stuff that you guys request. I do what 8-Pack wants. Alright, so what results did we get when testing this CPU at stock versus a 9700X and versus a 7800X 3D? The graphs of the results are going to be on the screen now, but I'm also going to read out a few relevant scores. So in our OC UK Blender test, this particular CPU took 1 hour 42 minutes, which is an 11% improvement over the 9700X and a full 50% generational leap on the 7800X 3D. So this is already telling me that the new CPU is absolutely fabulous at multi-core when you compare it to the previous gen. So not only really is it a gamer CPU, actually it's a very solid multi-core CPU with all 8 cores doing a really good job when faced with multi-core workloads. 3D Mark Firestrike graphics, which we scored 82,317, was a 0.61% improvement over the 9700X and 0.64% improvement over the 7800X 3D. The 3D Mark CPU profile, we had an 8.8% improvement over the 9700X and a whole 19.4% improvement over the 7800X 3D. Again, carrying on the multi-core proficiency that we've seen on this CPU. In terms of Cinebench R23 multi-core, we had an 11.5% improvement over the 9700X and we had a 19.4% improvement over the 7800X 3D. In R23 single core, we had a 6.6% reduction versus the 9700X, but a 12.4% improvement of the 7800X 3D. In Cinebench multi-core, the R24 this time, we had an 11.8% improvement over the 9700X and a 17.8% improvement over the 7800X 3D. Superposition, which is more of a gaming benchmark per se, we saw a 6.1% improvement over the 9700X and a 15.8% improvement over the 7800X 3D. Again, a really solid result in a gaming-based benchmark. On Final Fantasy benchmark, which was running at 1080p, but at fairly high graphical settings, we saw a 0.4% improvement over the 9700X and a 0.3% improvement over the 7800X 3D. Now I can only summarise really those improvements were so small because of the level of detail I was running was actually shifting the bottleneck of the benchmark over to the GPU. And I think we'll probably see that as we move through even more high overclock and PBO testing benchmarks, that benchmark doesn't seem to do much no matter what you throw at it CPU wise. But of course we'll look through the results in a little bit. In terms of Unigen Valley, we saw a 2.3% reduction versus 9700X, but a 21% improvement generation on generation versus 7800X 3D. And finally, in Unigen Heaven, which again was at 1080p with kind of medium detail settings, we saw a 2.14% improvement versus the 9700X and a 16.8% improvement versus the 7800X 3D. So overall, given the peaks and troughs of the new CPU, we saw an 11% improvement versus the 7800X 3D or the previous generation, which is a very solid generational leap. And it's a little bit more of a generational leap when you're comparing the 3D cache version versus the non-3D cache version. So what I mean is we're already covered in my videos like 9900X versus 7900X and found roughly it was 9.8 to 10% better generation to generation. With the 3D cache CPU, we're seeing that it's actually more than that, closer to 11% or even pushing up to 12% or even higher on some multi-threaded benchmarks. So well done to AMD for making these generational leaps. Obviously, as I've explained in a few of the benchmarks, the CPU doesn't seem to quite improve as well as maybe you would expect when you're comparing to, say, the 9700X. But we can only speculate in those benchmarks that maybe it's the GPU that's probably causing the bottleneck rather than the CPU. And it really is those benchmarks that are low resolution, medium detail that's affecting those kind of scores. So, all that, of course, is stock settings, completely stock bias. Let's see how we can now improve this CPU with some PBO2 tuning, some overclocking, and some memory overclocking and tuning. Okay, so what were the overclocking results? manual overclocking and PBO2. Right, firstly, let's say that PBO2 overclocking on this particular CPU made no statistical difference at all across all the benchmarks with my particular settings and with a few different settings I tried. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've only had this CPU 2 to 3 days before making this video. So there is really a lot more to be done with PBO2, and I didn't have time to explore in great detail the negative curve offsets and so on and so on. But what I did do was I had a negative voltage offset. I did have a negative curve of about -15. I set the limits of the CPU to coincide with the motherboard itself, and I had a scaling factor of about X5 and the memory at 5200 MHz expo. I'll notice no difference over stock. But I guess if you do spend time tweaking this, you will make gains. But for me, more gains were made in the static overclocking. So we're going to talk more now about static overclocking with the memory first at 5200 MHz and then with tuned memory. So with manual overclocking, I was able to make this particular CPU run very stably, rock stable for everything I ran. At 5.35 gigahertz, all cores, and it would do every single test running at 5.3 gigahertz with no issues whatsoever. This led to a top temperature seen of 90 degrees C on our 1 hour plus, well in this particular CPU's case, 1 hour 30 plus OCUK blender test. And that particular test drew 155 watts at 5.35 gigahertz on all cores. So basically what we had with this is 2.5% more power draw to get the extra performance, with temperatures still being very good. I think from stock we've only added 4 to 5 degrees on, and in fact from stock we've only added 4 watts of actual power draw by maintaining our top clock frequency all the time. So that being said, what were our actual results for this overclocking? In our blender test, we saw a 3.5% improvement over stock. In our 3D Mark V Strike physics test, we saw a 3% improvement over stock. CPU profile for 3D Mark was 4.9 over stock. Time Spy Extreme was 4.9% over stock. Cinebench with 5% improvement. Cinebench R24 was 2.8% improvement. Final Fantasy, strangely enough, was a 1% reduction, but of course we did discuss this particular benchmark in our stock review of the scores and said this is probably more GPU limited than anything else, and maybe it's something I should remove actually from my CPU reviews in future. Superposition, we saw a 3.35% improvement over stock. Unigem Valley was a 3% improvement, and Unigen Heaven was a 2.9% improvement. So overall, basically overclocking this CPU on a 240mm cooler with a memory at 5200 MHz saw a 3.2% improvement in performance, which was actually not too bad at all when you think all you're sacrificing is 4 degrees in terms of temperature and 4 watts in terms of power. So certainly static overclocking is worth doing, and if you compare this X2D result versus the previous generation, we're now up to a full 15% of improvement versus our X3D 7800 CPU. So after this overclocking testing at 5.35 gigahertz, I decided to keep the CPU at 5.53 gigahertz and now overclock the memory. So we moved the memory from 5200 megahertz all the way up to 6000 megahertz. And with the 6000 megahertz memory, the G.Skill 6 I have next to me here, we also tuned the timings with a very similar profile that was working reasonably strongly for us, around 3% improvement to 4% improvement on the 9950X and the 9900X, which I reviewed earlier. So I used pretty much those exact settings. Now what I did see in my benchmarks is an improved results, as you can see on the screen now. But the improvement in result across my suite of benchmarks was nowhere near as much as I saw with the 9950X or the 9900X in my testing. In fact, the maximum gain I saw in these particular benchmarks was 1.3%, whereas with the other CPUs non-3D within this generation, I saw like up to 5% improvement by just tuning memory. Now I can only really summarize that this 1.3% improvement is because of the level of L3 cache we've got here, and that the memory bandwidth is not really been taken full advantage of this by this particular CPU. Now I'm sure if you really pick specific benchmarks that like memory bandwidth and force memory bandwidth to be, if you like, a prime bottleneck, something like Abacus or OptiStruct or some of these finite element analysis programs or some of these simulation type things such as MATLAB, then the improvement will be more. But for me, on my benchmarking suite that I've been consistent with, literally the best I could get was 1.3%. I mean, it's still an improvement and it pushes our generational leap up towards 15% when you compare to the 7800X3D, but you'll have to weigh off whether you want to spend time tuning your memory to get such what is relatively a small increase in performance. So I really do like this CPU, and as is customary, anything I like, I make bundles or hardware upgrade bundles for that particular CPU. So for this CPU, yes, I will be making bundles which come with motherboard, thermal paste, memory, tuned memory, all the settings that we've described here in the overclocking embedded in the BIOS, so they're literally plug and play, and obviously they all come with AIO coolers. If you're interested in any of my bundles, click on the links in the description below. So in conclusion, it's now the king of gaming, and it's pretty easy to say that. And not like the previous generation CPU, which was a very good gamer, but pretty lame on multi-threading. This CPU is actually spectacular, very good on multi-threading. Tests like Blender now, it can really compete with the non-3D cache version at a similar clock speed. And in fact, in some multi-threaded tests, it actually beats the current gen CPU in multi-threading. So it's better for gaming and as good for multi-threading. And I really do approve and like this CPU, as you can tell by me introducing 3 bundles aimed at the customer who would particularly buy the CPU. Also, this particular CPU now has a lot of tuning, which the previous gen CPU didn't have, which I do like. It has PBO2 tuning, which obviously I didn't manage to do much on that with extracting extra performance, but you, the end user, can test a little bit more. And I'm sure in future I will actually get more time with the CPU and more time with the platform to try and push that a bit further. But obviously it has good static overclocking, keeping the CPU also at good temperatures. It has good memory overclocking, good memory tuning, with the sweet spot for memory still being around the 6000 megahertz mark. And also it's good for the tinker in that. And at the same time, it's not putting out a crazy amount of heat. So you can use a 240mm AIO quite easily, which opens up the usage of a lot more cases than when you need a 360mm cooler or even custom water cooling. And finally, as always, and what's custom for me now, please do not like the video. Certainly do not like our socials, or my socials, or anything to do with overclockers in fact. But do, of course, check out all my other 9000 series by AMD CPU reviews, which are, I'll be honest, the best on YouTube.